So our next two presenters are Karin Meyers from American University and Chris Rahlwes from Smith College.
Okay, I had some slides, but they don't seem to be prepared. So if you want my slides that actually, have some quotes on them, you can ask me for them and I'll send them to you. My first slide has the title of my talk, which is Against Naturalizing Buddhism, Karma, Rebirth in Children Who Remember Previous Lives. And it says that I'm at American University and that I'm Jay's kid's F91 Hampshire. So in my former life, in my first semester at Hampshire College, someone's good karma, I'm not sure whose, led me to a life-changing course with Jay, Skeptics and Idealists, East and West. I fell in love with philosophy as we discussed his draft translation of Nagarjuna's Mulavanyamaka, as well as some of those Western guys. The next winter, I was off to Sarnath to study at the Central Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies. As countless others can attest, Jay is an unfailingly generous mentor and colleague. His encouragement of others, as much as his own superhuman energies, have made for an unparalleled impact on the academic study of Buddhist philosophy. If karma ripens not only within the continuum of an individual, but in the lives of others, as Jay suggests, then Jay has birthed many lives in Buddhist philosophy. But karma is unpredictable. Only a Buddha can know its details. And like other of Jay's former students, I'm not only incredibly grateful for his support and humbled by his intellect, but also harbor some doubts and disagreements. So my talk today is extracted from an essay that was already too short to make a good argument, or to give a satisfying treatment of the topic, let me say. But hopefully it can still hopefully even this extracted talk can motivate some interesting conversation and debate. So here I go. A young boy in Sri Lanka sits spontaneously in meditation and begins chanting suttas in Pali in a form and manner that do not correspond to any modern editions or styles of chanting. He says that he was a monk in a former life and later speaks of traveling to Sri Lanka with the great master Buddhaghosa. That's slide one. Slide two. An American boy tells his mother that he remembers being someone else and longs for that other life when he was big. Over the next few years, he shares details about the life of an obscure Hollywood talent agent, which investigators are later able to verify with information unavailable to the family. What are we to make of such stories? How, if all, should they inform the way we think about Buddhist views on karma and rebirth? As Buddhism has become popular in the West, it has become commonplace to emphasize its compatibility with modern science while downplaying elements that conflict with modern physicalism and naturalism. And by physicalism, I mean the view that all phenomena require a physical cause or substrate. Physicalism, I argue, is the implicit metaphysical framework of the academy and defines the contours of common sense amongst educated people or in mixed company. It also tends to define the limits of nature, such that anything that appears to conflict with physicalism is deemed supernatural or impossible or at least highly implausible. For this reason, popular as well as scholarly books on Buddhism often naturalize it. That is, they interpret Buddhism in ways to make it consistent with modern physicalist assumptions about the limits of nature, either by bracketing elements of Buddhist tradition that do not fit neatly within a physicalist framework, or by reinterpreting them in naturalistic terms. And physicalism, of course, comes in a variety of flavors. I can't talk about them. But generally is understood to preclude the survival of consciousness after death, and thus rebirth. There are, of course, many elements of traditional Buddhism that are at odds with physicalism or modern ideas about what is natural, what I like to call the damn topics. Today, however, I will focus on the topic of rebirth with special attention to Jay's comments about it in his 2022 book, Buddhist Ethics, and then also contemporary research on children who appear to remember previous lives. So my interest in this topic is not the truth of Buddhist claims about rebirth per se, but how we should engage Buddhist ideas at odds with modern notions of the natural in our cross-cultural and constructive philosophical work. And by constructive, I mean drawing on or extending Buddhist insights to solve philosophical problems that interest us today, or to think about, maybe not solve. And so my questions include whether or how we should naturalize Buddhist ideas, what are the consequences of bracketing them or reinterpreting them in naturalistic terms, and are these ideas merely of historical interest, part of the task of understanding Buddhist ideas in their own historical and cultural context? Or should we take seriously the challenges posed by Buddhist views on the primacy of mind in the construction of our worlds? What, in other words, should we do with the mismatch between modern naturalism and classical Buddhist views on the dependent arising of mind and world? So in Buddhist ethics, Jay offers one approach to these questions as they pertain to rebirth. He describes Buddhist ethics as a kind of moral naturalism, and he acknowledges that traditional Buddhist ideas of the natural differ from his own, but offers an alternative naturalism as a framework for Buddhist ethics. And he describes this as this naturalism as an informative supervenience model, in which facts about human beings, including moral facts, are broadly explicable in the language of the natural or social sciences. He explains that this does not require reducing facts about us to physical facts, but is a demand that we frame theories that cohere with what else we know about the world. And if they are theories about the behavior of natural objects, such as human beings, they should be broadly explicable in terms of the most plausible other theories that we have about such things. This seems reasonable, provided that we really know what we think we know about the world, provided that our working theories are adequate to the available evidence and do not exclude contrary evidence, such as children who appear to remember previous lives. In the book, Jay brackets the role of rebirth. He brackets the role rebirth plays in Buddhist ethics on the ground that it either plays no significant role or is explicitly rejected both by many East Asian Buddhists and by many contemporary Buddhists in the West. And on the grounds that he finds it implausible on its face, and that ethical claims presented in classical texts are independent of the truth of rebirth. I don't quarrel with the claim that Buddhist ethics is a form of moral naturalism, or that much, of course, how we define the natural is an issue, or that much of Buddhist ethics may be intelligible without rebirth. I also agree that a naturalized interpretation of Buddhist ethics has considerable pragmatic and philosophical value. But I do take issue with the assumption that rebirth is obviously implausible and the implication that is not germane to our constructive philosophical work with Buddhism. As Jay notes, Buddhist traditions do offer psychological interpretations of rebirth that are more compatible with modern naturalism. This might be understood to authorize eliminating the cosmological view, but it is important to note that the psychological and cosmological are rarely, if ever, understood as alternative perspectives in classical Buddhist sources. They are taken to be complementary, as forming a complete picture of the mind and cosmos as navigated by the Buddhist path. Similarly, the abstract formula of dependent arising and the Abhidharma view that the 12 links can apply to a single moment do not tend to replace or supersede multiple lifetime readings of the 12 links of dependent origination. In respect to the closely related doctrine of karma, Jay naturalizes it by focusing on effects within a single lifetime and suggesting that effects across lifetimes can be understood as concerning the lives of other beings. Given the popularity of Pure Land, it is probably a stretch to say that this reflects the view of much of East Asian Buddhism, which I believe you say in the book. However, I do agree with the suggestion that directing our moral attention to our responsibilities inherited from others in the past and to our responsibilities to others who will follow us is morally salutary. This seems right, and I think it's consistent with classical Buddhist thought. I would just suggest that it can complement rather than replace constructive engagement with more traditional understandings about karma and rebirth. So why is naturalizing Buddhism a problem? What might be lost? First, and here I'll focus on rebirth specifically. First, rebirth is integral to the logic of most South Asian and Tibetan conceptions of the path and awakening. Though much of Buddhist ethics may be intelligible without rebirth, many would argue that the temporal and spatial scope for ethical and soteriological endeavor, that the temporal and spatial scope for ethical and soteriological endeavor it supplies is integral to the cognitive and affective dimensions of Buddhist practice. Second, naturalizing rebirth requires dismissing or significantly reconceiving Buddhist ideas about the relation of mind and world. Again, virtually no classical Buddhist theory agrees with modern physicalism or naturalism. Finally, and most important for our constructive work, perhaps we don't know enough about ourselves and the world to conclude that some variety of physicalism is true and that there is no survival of consciousness beyond death. The phenomena of children who appear to remember previous lives is but one indication that confidence in modern naturalism is built in part by systematically ignoring contrary evidence. While I think most people in Buddhist studies are aware of the research into children who remember previous lives conducted primarily but not only at the University of Virginia, it is rarely mentioned in philosophical works on Buddhism, even when they explicitly dismiss the possibility of rebirth. This may be due in part, at least in recent years, to the fact that there are philosophers who, to their credit, have discussed this research, namely Christopher Gowans and Evan Thompson. But I think they've given the false impression that there's nothing in this research that should challenge our inclination to dismiss the idea of rebirth. And they accomplish this by not focusing on the most recent research or the ways that methods have improved over the years. They kind of point out the methodological flaws in some of the early research. And they don't focus on the strongest cases. As discussed in Bhikkhu Analayo's 2018 book on the topic, and also in Jen Tucker's work, and I have these up on the slide so you can look them up, but I'll send you the slide. While conventional naturalistic explanations may suffice to explain some of the weaker cases, or even some elements of the stronger cases, they cannot explain the strongest cases like those mentioned at the opening of this talk. Moreover, psi theories regarding a psychic transfer of information by some means other than rebirth also fail to explain key aspects of these cases, such as the unusual play and emotional patterns exhibited by the children, the sense of purpose connected with the former personality, and birthmarks and other birth anomalies that sometimes accompany these memories. In this way, the strongest cases do not prove rebirth, but they can be reasonably understood as evidence in favor of the theory, or a theory of rebirth, and is a reason not to dismiss it out of hand. However, they say nothing about the mechanism or the universality of rebirth and do not provide evidence one way or another in favor of a specifically Buddhist view on karma or any one of the competing Buddhist views on karma. Nevertheless, they do suggest that we don't know as much as we think we might about our world, and that we should not impose modern naturalistic assumptions onto our constructive work with Buddhist ideas.
The way in which Jay has influenced my ideas and thinking are twofold. There's a point of disagreement, mostly concerns logic, Shakti and things like that. I'm not talking about that today. I mean, perhaps going against the strain of everybody else saying these kind of positions against Jay, I think I'm putting forward a position that agrees with Jay, which might be controversial. So within Jay's contemporary work, I'm thinking engaging Buddhism and his soon-to-be published book, Sonam on Kirti. He's been putting forward an account of contextualism, coherentism, and pragmatism, mostly at the epistemological front, but also with the metaphysical. And what I'm really after today is on a theory of truth. There's a nice kind of theory of truth that comes out of this that is weird. So what I'll do is I'll first explain the epistemological front, then I'll explain the metaphysical front, and then we'll move to truth. So staying in the realm of conventional truth, so ignore ultimate for a little bit, this account of coherentism takes epistemic justifications, or pramanas, to depend on their objects of knowledge, for me, and that the objects of knowledge depend on the epistemic justification. So these two things are interconnected, depending on each other. To explain this, I will focus on an example. This is an example from Kirti that Sonam focuses on, and then Jay books Sonam on. And that is of vision, so pramana perception. We can conclude an object exists when it is delivered to us via vision. Jay right there, and Jay exists. Yeah. We can conclude our vision is good when it delivers us visible object. Like many people here have glasses, so I'll take them off. This is a giant blur of nonsense to me. Did not deliver me Jay. So I know my vision without glasses is poor. So my perception through this specific lens fails me without this help of glasses. Now we might accept all this. This might be okay so far. The thing that really gets us to, I think, the coherentist point is there's a feedback loop between the two. So if our vision is improved, new visible objects may be delivered to us. So luckily I got glasses that improve my vision. Hey, I see everybody here. A lot of visible objects in front of me. Beyond that, if we say we can improve it even further than that, I can see things like ultraviolet lights and all that stuff. That's going to deliver me even more visible objects, perhaps. Now, if new visible objects are delivered to us, this may set a new standard for vision. The pramana may change depending on what objects are now received, setting forth a new standard, setting forth now new objects that exist. And this seems to be the epistemological front. The main support I find for this is specifically from Madhyamaka Avatara 6.24, from Kirti's analysis of conventional truth. He allows conventionally true things and conventionally false things. It's having both those really two grounds for this position. And that allows the Madhyamakas to have pramana. So since developing epistemic pramanas or epistemic justifications, can change the objects of knowledge, there's going to be inherently a metaphysical corollary here. That's going to tie us now into metaphysics regarding those objects. This corollary brings us to dependent origination, the roles that convention plays in that. And the points that Jay is following from on these two is Chandrakirti's commentary on the Ulamanakarika, in which Chandrakirti's glossing conventional, and also from Tsongkhapa and his analysis of the profound middle path of the Prasangika tradition, and when he explains the origination. I'm not going to explain any of that stuff. Instead, I'm going to give you an example. I think I've stolen this example from Jay. Let's check that. I'm pretty sure I have. It is the example of a jellyfish. We all know what jellyfishes are, I assume, so let's move forward on that. So a jellyfish is a mass of jelly-like substances, water, and various other proteins and cells. Anybody disagree with that definition? Okay, keep moving forward. So what differentiates a jellyfish from masses of jelly-like substances, proteins, and cells of other oceanic biomasses depends on our conventions and interests. That point on interest is important because that's where the pragmatism comes in. So let's talk about a specific type of jellyfish. The one I will focus on is the very deadly jellyfish called the sea wasp. So if this thing stings you, you die. So that's going to connect immediately to our interest as humans. We want to avoid a deadly sting because we don't want to die. So our interest guides us through our perceptual and cognitive apparatus to select this blob of stuff and call it the jellyfish, specifically the sea wasp jellyfish. Now the jellyfish as jellyfish arises when we correctly see and cognize it through our jellyfish-related practices. And this requires our ability to perceive the jellyfish next to our epistemological practices as well. And that creates a feedback loop. There's a feedback loop that's picking off the previous feedback loop. We may learn that the sea wasp jellyfish is actually two distinct species of jellyfishes. Maybe. This could happen. And what might differentiate those two jellyfishes is the type of venom they have. So for those with a clear cognitive and sensory apparatus that can recognize the key differences between those two species, this discovery will lead to two distinct phenomena. The phenomena of sea wasps, the phenomena of sea hornets, something like that. And importantly, this will lead us to new practices. So those practices may be the constructions of like anti-venom or painkillers. Sometimes they try to use venoms to make painkillers that are not good. So I think Jay agrees with all these points I've made. Should probably take over, and he's nodding his head, so we're good. What I think goes beyond Jay, and not too far, is how this connects to truth. So in the Mulamanakarika 13.1, the Nagarjuna defines truth as being non-deceptive. Or maybe he really defines falsity as being deceptive. Chandrakirti comes in and defines truth as being non-deceptive. And Tsongkhapa makes it very clear that this is the definition of truth. So that is, if you like to put in something more analytic feeling, X is true if and only if X is non-deceptive. X is false if and only if X is deceptive. It'd be very helpful for us to define what non-deception and deception are now. So I'll provide a few translations, and I haven't seen Jay articulate specific translations, so this is the point that's going beyond what I've seen him do. So for our first try of defining non-deception, here's the definition I propose. So something is non-deceptive when it appears as if it will fulfill its socially determined functions and is disposed to fulfill those functions. I'll come back with another translation in a second. Let's define deception. So something is deceptive when either does not appear as if it fulfills those socially determined functions, or it does appear as if it will, but is not disposed to. So I don't know if we like nice functional definitions. Maybe some of us do, maybe some of us don't. So let me simplify it a little bit. So something that is non-deceptive, for it to be non-deceptive, it appears to be what it is, and it does what it's supposed to do, based off our social convention. Something is deceptive when it either does not appear to be what it is, or does not do what it's supposed to do. So there's two conditions in which something can be false on this understanding. I was thinking about this the other night, and the kind of 2 points of those is the first kind of criteria concerns more the form of the thing. The second concerns more the function. So this account of truth applies to everything. Absolutely all the stuff, all of you, all of the other stuff. Statements, it applies to statements, propositions, beliefs, views, phenomena. So all the stuff that analytic philosophers or truth care about, it applies to all that stuff. It also applies to like the water in this cup. And we'll focus on that example. So I'll limit it onto the phenomenological or the phenomena talk with water as the example. I don't have time to hear too much as an example, so let's look at water. So water is true when it appears as water, is water, so that's the form of water, and is a clear, thirst-quenching liquid. So water appears to be water, it is water in this sense, and it also serves the function that we have given water. So if we as a society determine that water is something that's thirst-quenching, it's true. Like I have to say water. Okay. So that's going to leave us with a lot of false waters. The first false water is a mirage. A mirage appears to be water, it's not water. So that's false water. The case that started to make things a little bit more weird is seawater will be false water in this account. Seawater is water, so it meets the first criteria. But it is not thirst quenching. You drink a bunch of seawater, you will die. So don't do that. This connects us back to our feedback loops. So the social conventions regarding water may change, leading us to new ideas for the function of water. So if our practices of chemistry, for example, become dominant, true water may be seen as pure H2O, which is used for practices of diluting acids. If this becomes the main way we see water as a society, that defines what water is. More specifically defines what true water is. So to bring this together, and I'll wrap up with one last example. Truth is dependent on conventions and practices, which also depend on the interrelation of epistemic justification, phenomena, and objects of knowledge. This sets up what we can demarcate, so the things that we can turn into objects and stuff, through their appearance, and what functions, phenomena, or propositions can have. And I will wrap up with one last example of a true phenomenon. So let's define a teacher as someone who facilitates learning through instructing or guiding. We'd like to take definition, so we can map onto conventions pretty well. Let's specify what a true teacher is. So that's a teacher that empowers students to see and think beyond what they have been given. And then a false teacher will be a teacher that emphasizes conformity and rejects openness. And based on all the talks we've had so far, I think we can say Jay is a true teacher. Thank you.
Just to clarify, Chris, can a chair be false water?
Yes. So I'm probably committed, there's probably going to seem like a po-hunting down here, but I would be committed that because a chair lacks the structure of water, it would be false
So
water.
anything that's not true water is false water.
No. Like, yes. Here's like a dialectic point that's thinking in, I don't know. So anything that's not true water is false water. I admit it. Yeah.
You're getting led down a garden path by Guerrero here, aren't you? She began by asking, could a chair be false water? And you said yes. And then she led you to that next step, and you shouldn't have gone that way. You shouldn't have swallowed that bait, I don't think.
I'm trying to figure if that is what the account's committed to.
I don't think so. Because if I understood you correctly, I shouldn't be defending you, but but I'm going to. Because you're right. I mean, you really link this to deceptiveness and non-deceptiveness. And you could imagine a weird situation in which a chair deceptively appears to be water but isn't. But like if we look around the room right now, none of these chairs are deceiving us and none of them are disposed to deceive us. So these chairs really aren't false water. But if you could imagine, maybe a chair made out of rippling glass or something that was backlit, then it might deceive you into thinking of it. I can imagine that kind of chair being false water. But I took it that your functional description and your description in terms of deceptiveness and non-deceptiveness gave you the resources to answer yes to Laura's first
But no, to second.
but no to her second. She's devious.
Okay, so in response to that, we go back to my analytic ways and let's look at the definition. So I have, it appears as if it fulfills a socially determined function and is disposed to fulfill those functions as non-deceptive. A chair does not appear as if it's water on that account. So that would commit me to the position that chairs would not be false water. So if you're, hallucinating, the chair looks like water, okay. If you have some misconception, that will be false water. So it will depend on the individual to some degree, but it's mostly at the social level is concerned. It's a little bit cleaner of a response. My first cup.
Yeah, you guys are in charge. So just because you're talking about water, you mentioned Tsongkhapa at the beginning of your talk. I mean, my mind went to the weird thing that Tsongkhapa does where he's talking about water from the perspective of human beings and water from the perspective of hungry ghosts is actually, pus and blood. I mean, I'm just wondering how that sort of example maps onto what you're talking about here.
So I give the example of humans. So it's whatever society of those things to some degree. So for hungry ghosts, water would be, was it like pus and blood? That would be true water for hungry ghosts. So it is completely dependent on that. We could keep it naturalist if we like. I'm not necessarily inclined to that, but we could think of like, what is water for a fish? So it's something it can survive and swim.
The hungry ghost is not satisfied by, his thirst is not quenched by the pus and blood.
Yeah, so it's, the definition of water is going to depend on the type of being the thing is.
Yeah, I want to touch upon your linkage with water and your comment about like pyramid, because the clear imagery associated with like bodhisattvas and water, like throughout Yogacara texts, the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra mentions Dharma Mega, which is like the cloud of Dharma either caused by the Buddha or is the Buddha raining down the Dharma, and the bodhisattva after going through the 10 stages is so advanced enough that their sense perceptions that rain falling down is almost like wisdom like directly entering their body, or the ocean of compassion is like another example of water use. Does your from your frame of reference, does treating logical arguments of what appears to be water and what functionally is water map out onto how bodhisattvas, I guess, like use water in those types of systems and superlative metaphors, because there are superlative metaphors used.
Yeah, I'm afraid that you're trying to commit me to like a position that like what water is objectively. I will not. I mean, there is not that position for there. So for the question maybe that you're really after is what is true water for a bodhisattva?
Sure.
I think my answer is I don't know. I'm not a bodhisattva, but I'm trying to think of literature in which there's something mapped on. So we like talk about true water for the devas and stuff like Rita or something. That's not going to help us. But the connection of water and kind of knowledge, and that is definitely there. but I don't think I can answer your question better than that.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Just to follow up on some of the conversation so far. So you don't want there to be objective water,
Yeah.
and yet the non-deceptiveness seems to depend on a set of functional capacities of the particular thing. And that sounds Dharmakirtian because it is. I'm thinking of, and so, I mean, how free-floating can these conventions be from the, how free-floating can conventional agreements be from the functional capacities of particulars, and are they ultimately grounded on those functional capacities in a way that would not allow for you to make the kind of purely coherentist vision?
Yeah, so for grounding might be too strong, there would be strong limitations. So the grounding gives me a from essence stock, and I don't think we get essence stock, and maybe if the fruit came in the audience, we'd accept what. But basically, the type of thing, or really this kind of substance that we've labeled as water, so we apply this construct onto it. So this takes, water to be a social construction, like climate, things like that. And that's going to be limited to some degree of what can do the function we're doing it. And that's out there. I'm fine with that being to some degree out there. Full grounding might be a little too strong for that account. So I'm a little bit of wiggle room there. That exact limit will be tricky, and that might depend on what words, not words, we're talking about objects here, but what object we're talking about. And I mean, the catch is because it's even labeling the object as water without saying it's true water, we're still kind of labeling some of these basic functions of that thing. Like the example of teachers, like here's the most basic understanding of a teacher. And then we have maybe like the exemplar version of water as it fulfills all these other functions that we really care about. So that will be constrained by what's out there.
Look, just a little follow-up on that, just to endorse what Chris is saying, but to give it a little more texture, maybe. Because you talked a lot about the relationship and the interdependence of pramanas and pramayas. But there's a piece that Chandrakirti does that you left out that I think helps you in a moment like this. And that's the interdependence of the different pramanas. So, yeah, does that make sense? And because then what we can say is, look, some of our pramanas are pramanas for honing and refining other pramanas. We call this the Hasak Chang phenomenon, right? And that means, so when you were talking about vision, for instance, you kind of left out the fact that some of your trust for your visions is grounded on Shabda.
Yeah.
The fact that your ophthalmologist tells you, this is what your prescription is, man. And that you're willing to go along with your ophthalmologist because you trust your ophthalmologist because they've worked for other people, so you've got an analogy going on, right? And so a lot of what's happening, I think, in this coherentist model is that we've got a situation in which we can refine our pramanas through successful practice. And that helps to give you a kind of non-foundationalist model of constraint. Pramanas are constrained by one another as well as being constrained by what they deliver. What they deliver is constrained by the pramanas that we choose, but those are constantly evolving.
But also what they deliver is going to be determined by or constrained by the particulars that we're knowing.
There's constraint all around them. There's no single thing that's constraining everything else. That's the important point. And that's Chandrakirti's point.
Christian.
Sure. So I take it you agree with Jay on his sort of coherentist, sort of pragmatist account, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is if indeed, Chandrakirti is account of the conventional arrest and recognizing the difference between deceptiveness and non-deceptiveness, right? Or failing to understand, is there sort of a ground for deceptiveness, establishing deceptiveness itself? I'm losing my ability to speak here, the jet lag. And since water has been the topic, I mentioned water too, and I mentioned water in the context of its sort of essential properties. Mm-hmm. You mentioned quench thirsty, but water also affords immersion and lots of other things, putting out fires. And so, in your view, does the coherentist have enough resources at their disposal to establish something like, a ground for our kind of what counts as water, in sort of in a functional sense and so on. Because I mentioned wetness, right? Well, as I said, by the standards of modern definitions of water, water is not wet, but it's understood in terms of its wetness is understood in terms of its the relation between adhesive and cohesive forces. Well, those are objective measures and metrics. They depend on the nature of things. They don't seem to depend on. We don't establish that by roll call. By sort of conventional agreement and so on and so forth. I mean, there is a way that those forces work, and it's not a matter of taking an opinion poll here and say how many people think it's on the basis of this or that. It's something sort of it's intrinsic to the thing itself. So, are there resources there to push against that view, or
This might be where my Persian pragmatism leans into. It's like we can have water as convention across all society, all of us, and all that, and that might make it to be thirst quenching. But if we want to accept something like a first framework, it's by the coherence of scientists dealing with it. And so that coherentism might be the dominant one. And so that still keeps water. We have the form of water as being, pretty closely connected to H2O. It's fine. Maybe we learned that it's, should label as H2O. We want to label it as, I don't know, the protons, the neutrons, the H2O, whatever. We can limit this down. But the specific functions, those I take to be very flexible for society, and it's going to be based off what most interest us in that thing. And if we follow a person, the scientific, coherentism really is the key point. And so I think first, following that pragmatic lens, we get something a little bit that might satisfy somewhere in your direction.
can I follow? And if you say I belong to a group of interested people, in my community, we would like water not to be wet. Right. And so we've established by agreement that we all agree that in our community, water doesn't count as wet. Right. Would our agreement suffice to unwet water, or?
No, I like this question. So, on the functional frameworks, we have form function. On the functional, yeah, definitely, sure. True water, if you could say, if it's wet, it's not true water. If you convince everybody that's the case, fine with it. On the form area, I have to think about that point. That's a nice point. And this is the reason I know you're bringing in, so we're trying to get some type of essentialism right here. And so at the form level, I don't know. I mean, so if we take money as social convention, as it is, right, the $20 bill, that's the value that we give it, it's the paper stuff. So we can hypothetically change the form of water to some degree if we take that and we can take, something else as money as a new boost. So I might be willing to have that divided, but now the issue, I think we're moving to semantics, not objects. So for functions, I'll repeat kind of the first response. Yeah, sure, for the actual form, that might be trickier because that actually is based off what water is in a sense. Then that can get us to essentialism is the question I think you're after. I don't think so, because I think I'm fine with it doing these kind of constricting, but not grounding. So does this ground water or not is the real question. I should probably jump around. One pick answer, is that good?
Steve?
In regard to your paper, I think it's important to point out that from early times, denial of rebirth was regarded as wrong view that will lead you to hell to somebody who led you there. It's considered ethically catastrophic, and you can see this throughout the Buddhist literature. So in terms of representation, it's really crucial. But I also had we had a NEH seminar a few years ago, Krishna was there and Jay, and one of the things that really stuck was on conceptions of self in the East and West or something like that. Not one single person in the entire room and these sort of conceptions of self discuss past influences, like intergenerational influences. Not one single person, Buddhists, psychologists, all these different types of experts. And it seems evident, scientifically speaking even, that the moment of experience that each one of us is having in this moment is conditioned by thousands of generations of psychological processing. That the collective imaginaire is something that we carry like biological hosts. When we die, it's going to roll on like it never skipped a beat into birth and death, birth and death, birth and death, into new people. And that seems very reasonably conceived as karmic and intergenerational and ethically significant.
And I like the point, I mean, I really like the point that Jane makes, that even when we just confine this to our effects on other beings and how other beings, like, I do think that's really morally salutary and should be part of our thinking about Buddhist ethics. And I think we can also, but I just don't want to just throw out entirely the idea of survival of consciousness, because I just think it's so contrary to so much of Buddhist metaphysics and understanding of the relationship between mind, action, and world. You know, I think maybe, you already asked? No.
I don't know, but I'd ask.
I've not been paying attention to the order of hands, but. Yeah, was there one back? Yeah, okay, student, yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed both of your talks, especially like kind of like around issues of truth and how we come to like collective consensus of like what are true, especially in an era that a lot of people are talking about as like post-truth politics. And I was interested in how you guys see your work speaking to one another, because I was really struck by your comment about like a lot of like Western physicalism and like rational ways of thinking like being built on systemically ignoring contrary evidence. And similarly, Chris, that's my teacher. Like your conception of jellyfish-related biases, which is a hilarious term, but like a very good point. So yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on what you see as the connections between your work.
I'll just say something quick, because I thought we had to, I was confused about the format until like late Thursday afternoon. Anyway, I thought we had to respond to each other, and I thought, oh, well, I have to find a connection. And so I was reading Chris's paper, and I'm like, oh, okay, there's an argument. I don't have any possible like way to make it in, 15 minutes. But about, well, yeah, it all comes down to conventional truth. How are we thinking about what constitutes conventional truth, and what interests define it, and in terms of, I'm going to have to think about it in terms of the different pramanas classically and how they're working together. But I think that is a link, is thinking about, and is it conventional truth? I mean, sometimes there's this idea, well, obviously our contemporary scientific view, look how much we've like revealed about the material world. Well, does that mean that we've like only built and gotten like better conventions or more useful conventions, or are there maybe some ways of seeing and being that have dropped out of the picture that are useful and salutary and maybe worth, engaging with constructively?
To follow up the point on the post-truth material, that literature normally is following out of like taking truth to be correspondence, which is that my propositions I have, or statements, whatever, is nothing snow white. The truth of that depends on it corresponding to the state of affairs. The snow is white, the whiteness of the snow, that is. For the post-truth thing, the thing we're seeing, and especially in different arenas, is that you get stuff like bold-faced lies, in which someone's just saying a lie that would be false under correspondence theory of truth. However, that might not be false on a coherentist picture of truth, and that should be concerning.
I was wondering, on the topic of rebirth, would you say, I know that Western intellectualism is influenced a lot by Western religions, but would you say it's more Western intellectualism or Western religion that sort of pushes up against the idea of, or any sort of ideas of rebirth?
I don't know. I mean, I think most of my colleagues in Buddhist philosophy are not that much persuaded by Western religious ideas. So, but I think maybe there's some implicit prejudice there. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, I was just
going to reiterate something that the student back there was talking about, kind of connecting you two's papers. How would it sound to you applying some of these ideas from the philosophy of language to your question about naturalizing Buddhism? In other words, does it do violence to the text to present a naturalized Buddhism to an interested party, to parties who are only interested in naturalism? Is that kind of acceptable in terms of shifting what you're saying towards your audience, or do you think that that's too far afield from the traditional Buddhist view?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Just
You
in
can
terms
just
of,
hear.
how much would you accept kind of naturalized Buddhism if you're writing it for an audience who's only interested in naturalized views, right?
I mean, I think it has lots of pragmatic value, and I don't usually talk to my, I mean, it's one thing teaching in Kathmandu, but teaching in American University, I'm not spending a lot of time, talking about rebirth. So, but I don't know if you were asking about.
I don't need it on a deep philosophy of language level, just
Okay,
in terms of how to do Buddhist pedagogy. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's pragmatic to not talk about the damn topics, but that's sort of what irritates me about it too, is because I feel like I'm just not, I'm sort of like, don't like dogmatism in any, so I sometimes get the feeling that just automatically dismissing these worldviews where we totally respect their, ancient Buddhist theories about mind and world, and we're applying, but then we're limiting them by our own sort of contingent, contemporary views about how things work, which are just also excluding a lot of things that we don't understand. And we don't really understand the physical world either, right? So, Mark.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm curious about this idea of naturalized Buddhism, how it might relate to issues today and bioethics. So the Buddhist discourse about bioethics is, I find, very weak. I teach a class in bioethics in Asia, and I'm constantly looking for something about Buddhism that can help clarify things. So in my course, for example, I talk about bioethical debates happening. This is happening right now. So it's very much about the pragmatic implications of Buddhist tradition in the world today. And there's so many questions that come up in bioethical research that people don't have answers for. And so the debate that happens in India, the debate that happens in China, the debate that happens in Korea and Japan, they're all different. And the only thing that links all these cultures seems to be Buddhism. And yet, how does Buddhism link them? So I'm just curious if you have a particular view about that, like issues of genetic engineering or euthanasia, things like this. Even surrogacy is a huge bioethical conundrum in Asia right now. And the Buddhists the tradition of how Buddhism actually functions, right, obviously includes, past lives and future lives and identity over time, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wonder if you have any insights into this or any feelings about this.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that discourse, what they're talking about to say anything. I mean, I just think of, that ethically it does enter into some traditional Buddhist views about abortion, right? That's, I guess, the extent to which I'm familiar of how different Buddhist cultures think about that. I don't know. I maybe need your syllabus, and then I can have better answer. There was a question. Oh yeah, up here. Back. Yeah, just
If you want to first.
Sure. I think this sort of is related to the bioethics question. I guess I'm just wondering, if you could have things perfectly your way, and remove just be yes, I've convinced everyone of what I'm trying to argue, what do you see as the value of adopting a less naturalized sort of framework around rebirth? What do you think would be an ideal or even the ideal outcome of accepting the veracity of consciousness continuing after death.
Yeah, I guess it's not, I guess it's more accepting the possibility. And so then what does that mean about how we understand Buddhist ideas about the path and awakening and ethical practices? And I think they look different when we have that perspective than if we just have a naturalistic perspective. And so now exactly the detail of what that all involves.
But to that, like, you're sort of seeing it as a matter of, like, for your interest at least, like textual interpretation and scriptural interpretation?
No, so yeah, I resist that this has to be merely a historical, like we can only think about rebirth when we're thinking historically about Buddhism. I guess I want to bring in the possibility of the survival of consciousness into our constructive discussions about Buddhist ideas, about epistemology, ontology, how mind relates to world, dependent arising, and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, so to follow that, how important is, in regards to sense perception and truth, the dream state for someone trying to understand Buddhism and also making sense of like culture and Buddhist modernism now? Because for me, as a musician, there are different gurus that come into my dreams after I've mastered a piece like far enough. For example, there's a Sufi musician named Mr. Fateh Khan. Despite the fact that he comes to me in a dream as like a Sufi music teacher, he came to the people of Japan as a singing Buddha in 1980, as I understood him to be, because he was singing Indian classical music, which sort of felt familiar to them, and there's sort of a theoretical connection with India and Japan in that sense. But also, he sung in the same ragas and the same meters that are also used in Java Shinshu. I say that because there's a specific rag associated with the Amitabha Buddha, the rag components, that is also used with Sanskrit syllables. So to them, that was sort of their cultural connection, but also an establishment of Buddhist modernism in the sense that everybody, like through their own diverse perceptions, makes something different. Because he comes to me in a dream despite the fact that he's dead, but simultaneously he came to the people of Japan as a singing Buddha, despite not coming in the same culture, so to speak, of the Sufi Punjabi musician. So how important is the dream state, is what I'm saying?
Dream state?
Yeah, in the context of making...
I mean, that's another damn topic which I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the intersubjective nature of some of these states, which we tend to think are just private, but yet also, so having a culturally conditioned element, not just being completely, and being possibly shared and not just private. And I think we have Buddhist resources for talking about those kinds of things, but not if we just, want to take the possibility of what you just described as off the table as something, plausible and a phenomena that, yeah, I don't know if that, sorry, I'm using my...
Yeah, I only wanted to contextualize it because like 8 years ago there was a Naturalizing Symposium that Jay and like some other people that have been a part of here. And like Sandy, who was like the person like debating with Jay, said that there are different arguments that appear in different forms. So like an argument in the book that I forget the name I used, To Kill a Mockingbird. The argument that's used in To Kill a Mockingbird is different from an argument that appears when you're dreaming about it. But also like the functionality of the argument isn't actually good enough argument to use in like debate and textualization. It just comes in a different form. Which is my justification for saying, like, what about the dream state? And that perception of truth. Does 1 + 1 = 2 if it appears to you in a dream and somebody says, like, does that, like, make you feel more connected, particularly some of versus, like, something extra? What do these numbers mean? Something like that.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. There were a lot of points that I'm not sure I totally followed. But
it's so open-ended. It's really.
So this might maybe this could continue into our short break because I want to make sure that we're staying on task here and on time. So thank you to